This story is a historical horror narrative inspired by real events in the life of Edward H. Rulloff, 1844 to 1871, often called the Genius Killer. While based on historical records, court documents, and contemporary accounts, the following text is written as a creative, dramatized, and extended narrative for storytelling purposes. Some dialogues, inner thoughts, and atmospheric details are fictionalized to enhance immersion. The intention is not to glorify violence, but to explore the disturbing duality of genius and cruelty within one man's life. Reader discretion is advised due to dark themes, psychological horror, and depictions of crime. The year was 1844. America was still a land of restless expansion. Railroads carved new scars into the wilderness, and towns bloomed like mushrooms after the rain. It was a time of invention, debate, and reform. Yet in the quiet countryside of New York State, in places where the soil was still tilled by hand and church bells ruled the rhythm of Sundays, something darker stirred in the life of a boy named Edward H. Rulloff. From the beginning, he seemed touched by destiny. His family, neither wealthy nor especially remarkable, soon realized they were raising a child unlike any other in their small world. By the age of 5, Edward could read passages of the Bible aloud with such clarity and confidence that older men in the village paused in disbelief. Words became his playground, and language his secret kingdom. But where other children laughed and played in the meadows, Edward's eyes searched with an intensity that unsettled neighbors. He listened more than he spoke, memorized more than he shared. And when he did speak, it was often to correct, to prove, to assert. The boy with a hunger for knowledge, it began with books. Anything he could get his hands on, old sermons, scraps of classical texts, borrowed volumes from schoolmasters. He read them with an insatiable hunger, often reciting entire paragraphs word for word after a single glance. His photographic memory became legendary in the small communities he inhabited. Teachers whispered, "The boy remembers everything." But knowledge to Edward was not just a tool, it was a weapon. He learned not only to absorb facts but to twist them into arguments, to confound others, to dominate conversations. By the age of 12, he could outdebate men twice his age, weaving Latin phrases into his speech, quoting philosophers with an unnerving certainty. Yet beneath this brilliance lay a darker current. He despised being questioned. If someone corrected him, his jaw would tighten, his eyes narrow into a cold stare that silenced even adults. His mind was a furnace, brilliant but dangerous. Shadows in childhood accounts from neighbors suggested Edward displayed moments of cruelty, especially toward animals. A neighbor's dog, once friendly, began to cower when Edward approached. Chickens went missing from coops. Small carcasses were sometimes found near the riverbank. Nothing was proven, but whispers spread. Even among other children, he was feared. His words cut sharper than fists. He would humiliate weaker boys in lessons, mocking their inability to remember dates or recite lines. And if anyone dared fight him, Edward didn't fight fair. He bit, clawed, and struck with a cunning that felt less like play and more like vengeance. The community saw a prodigy, yes, but also something unnatural. The language of power by adolescence, Edward's fascination had crystallized into obsession. Language. He believed that words were more than communication, they were the keys to controlling thought itself. If he could master every tongue, if he could reduce human speech to a universal code, he might shape reality itself. This was not a passing fancy. Consumed him. While others worked the fields, he filled notebooks with strange symbols, invented grammars, and constructed patterns no one else understood. To Edward, ordinary language was flawed. It trapped humans in misunderstanding. He would create something perfect, something eternal, but perfection has a cost. His family began to notice his temper, his neglect of daily duties, his long absences in the woods or attic where he scribbled furiously by candlelight. And when confronted, he would lash out. Not with violence yet, but with words so cold and cruel that even his parents struggled to meet his gaze. First signs of manipulation, Edward discovered another gift, the ability to manipulate. With charm, intelligence, and a calculated show of vulnerability, he could win trust. He would feign humility before teachers, only to later expose their ignorance in front of students. He would appear gentle to elders, yet secretly encourage younger children to follow his commands, daring them into reckless acts while he watched from the shadows. In these moments, Edward tasted something more intoxicating than knowledge: control. And once tasted, he would never let it go. Foreshadowing darkness, by the time Edward turned 16, the village had formed two opinions of him. Some called him the boy genius, destined for greatness, perhaps to be a professor or a man of letters. Others muttered that there was something wrong with him: too cold, too proud, too calculating. In hushed tones, stories circulated of his explosive temper, his obsession with control, his unsettling fixation with life and death. A neighbor once found him staring at a dead bird with what she described as the curiosity of a surgeon, not the sadness of a boy. The double life had begun to take form. Edward the prodigy, admired, envied, respected, and Edward the shadow, whose brilliance masked an emerging darkness that few dared name. The Rulloff household was not one of wealth. Edward's father worked long hours in the soil, his hands rough and scarred, his back bent from years of labor. His mother, though loving, was burdened by the endless cycle of housework and caring for the children. They had little to offer Edward beyond the basics. And yet, the boy consumed more than they could give. Books were borrowed from neighbors, purchased secondhand when coins could be spared, or begged from distant relatives. Whenever Edward received one, he devoured it with an intensity that frightened even his parents. He doesn't just read. His mother confided to a visiting cousin once. He absorbs. It's like the words climb into him and live there. And when he looks at you, it's as though he knows what you're thinking before you speak. This burden of raising a genius weighed heavily on them. At first, they were proud, but pride gave way to unease. Edward was not affectionate. He rarely laughed, rarely played. He corrected his mother's speech, mocked his siblings' mistakes, and demanded silence when he was reading. The household tiptoed around him. A boy of 12 had become the quiet tyrant of his own home. Schoolyard superiority in school, Edward's reputation only grew. His teachers alternated between awe and exasperation. He could memorize entire pages of Latin text after a single recitation. He could dismantle an arithmetic problem in moments, explaining it with a clarity that embarrassed his instructors. And yet, he refused to follow structure. Lessons bored him. He corrected his teachers with such cold confidence that classrooms often fell into uncomfortable silence. Other children began to resent him. They whispered about his arrogance, his sharp tongue, his habit of watching others as though calculating their weaknesses. He did not fit. He did not belong. And perhaps he never wanted to. One teacher, frustrated by Edward's constant interruptions, once snapped, "If you're so clever, perhaps you should teach the class yourself." Edward rose, calm and unflinching, and proceeded to do just that. For 15 minutes he explained a complex passage of Latin poetry with such detail that even the teacher could not refute him. The students watched in a mixture of amazement and fear. When he sat back down, the room was silent. Edward smirked. He had won again. Cruel amusements with brilliance came cruelty. Edward began to experiment, not only with language but with power. He discovered that lies, spoken with confidence, could shape the behavior of others. He tricked younger boys into stealing apples for him, convincing them that he had struck a secret deal with the orchard owner. He told a neighbor girl that a certain flower, if plucked, would bring her luck. She pricked her hand on thorns and wept. Edward only watched, expressionless. Animals became his darker playground. Cats disappeared. Dogs barked at his approach. Once, a farmer claimed he found Edward prodding a trapped bird with a stick, murmuring as though taking notes. The farmer shouted, but Edward simply looked up with calm defiance, unafraid, and walked away. The farmer later told others, that boy's eyes were not the eyes of a child. They were the eyes of someone dissecting the world. The silent woods. Edward often wandered into the woods for hours, sometimes days. He carried notebooks filled with symbols, fragments of languages, and invented alphabets. Villagers whispered that he spoke to himself, pacing among the trees, reciting strange sentences in Greek, German, or languages no one recognized. One neighbor swore he saw Edward carving markings into a tree trunk, then standing back as though testing their meaning. When asked what he was doing, Edward replied flatly, "I'm fixing what's wrong with language." The neighbor laughed nervously, but Edward's expression never changed. He believed it. In those woods, Edward was alone, and yet not. He was surrounded by the echoes of his obsessions, the shadows of his thoughts. Every sound of cracking branches, every cry of a distant crow, seemed to fold into his private universe. There, among the trees, he rehearsed the double life he was crafting. Outwardly brilliant, inwardly consumed by something colder, stranger, and more dangerous. A temper unveiled though often composed, Edward's temper lurked beneath the surface like a coiled serpent. Took little to awaken it. Once, during a family meal, his younger brother mocked him for always scribbling nonsense in his notebooks. Edward's fork clattered onto the table. His eyes burned with fury. "You mock what you cannot understand," he hissed, standing so suddenly that the bench tipped. "When the world speaks my language, when mankind bends to my creation, you will beg me for forgiveness." The room froze. His mother tried to calm him, but Edward stormed outside, fists clenched, muttering in a blend of English and broken Latin. Neighbors said he often returned from such outbursts with red eyes, as though crying, but not with sorrow, with rage. The burden of brilliance. By the mid-1850s, Edward had grown into a young man marked by contradictions. He was admired yet feared, intelligent yet arrogant, charming when it suited him, yet merciless when crossed. People said he was destined for greatness. Some whispered he was destined for ruin. One old preacher, after speaking with Edward, told his congregation, "That boy is not like others. He has been given a gift, but mark my words, if he turns that gift toward wickedness, there will be blood in his path." The words lingered. They would prove prophetic. By the age of 14, Edward had stepped beyond the limits of his local schooling. He consumed knowledge at a rate his teachers could not match, often staying up until dawn with a candle stub flickering over pages of Greek grammar, philosophy, or natural sciences. Villagers admired the sight of a boy who read by lamplight while others slept. Yet admiration turned into unease. The books he collected were not simply for learning, they were for building something. Edward spoke often of a grand design, a project of such magnitude that, in his words, "the world would one day thank me for saving it from confusion." His friends, if they could be called that, didn't understand. To most boys his age, the world was a place of chores, small flirtations, the dream of future work. To Edward, it was a problem to be solved. Humanity itself was flawed, and he alone could fix it. This was no longer the curiosity of a child. It was the conviction of a fanatic. Experiments in secrecy. Edward's notebooks grew stranger. What began as copied texts in Latin or Greek transformed into pages filled with invented alphabets. Some resembled symbols of mathematics, others seemed like geometric codes. He called these models early fragments of the universal language he envisioned. To test his theories, he began to experiment, not with willing partners but with anyone who fell into his orbit. He would speak to a neighbor in convoluted sentences, testing whether they misunderstood his phrasing. He would deliberately misquote scripture to see if the pious would notice. He once convinced a boy that a nonsense phrase he had created was a rare Latin blessing. The boy repeated it at church. The congregation laughed. Edward smiled, but not with joy, with triumph. Every human interaction became a laboratory. To Edward, people were not companions. They were subjects. The mask of charm. For all his arrogance, Edward learned to wear a mask. He discovered that, when he wished, he could be charming, even disarmingly so. He could flatter elders, impress young women with his memory, and pose as a humble learner before those in authority. But the mask slipped often. When challenged, his charm cracked into contempt. His compliments became barbs. His patience turned to cruelty. He seemed less a boy among others than an actor in a role he had already outgrown. This duplicity, the smiling prodigy versus the cold manipulator, would define the rest of his life. Cruel Lessons cruelty became both a test and a game. One autumn, a group of boys were daring each other to cross a half-frozen pond. Edward, watching from the bank, persuaded the smallest boy to walk farther out, whispering that the ice was stronger in the middle. The child obeyed. The ice cracked. He plunged waist-deep into freezing water before scrambling out, shivering and terrified. Edward laughed. Not the laughter of mischief, but the thin, satisfied chuckle of a scientist observing an experiment's result. When confronted, he insisted. He should have known better. The weak are always fooled first. The others avoided him after that. But Edward didn't mind. Their avoidance only proved what he already believed. That he was different. Superior. Alone. Conflicts at home, Edward's temper deepened. He dismissed his parents' authority, arguing with his father over religion, over work, over duty. He called his mother ignorant when she mispronounced a word. He refused chores, insisting his time was too valuable to be wasted on manual labor. His siblings grew to resent him. They whispered about his strange habits, the way he muttered to himself at night, the way he stared at them with an almost clinical detachment, as though dissecting them in his mind. But no one could stop him. His brilliance shielded him. Parents excused him. Teachers marveled at him. And Edward learned that the world would forgive his arrogance as long as it admired his genius. The first rumors of darkness by 16, the whispers had grown. Some villagers claimed he had harmed animals. Others claimed he stole books from traveling peddlers. One rumor told of Edward sneaking into a barn at night, found scribbling symbols on the walls by lantern light. When confronted, he muttered about testing structures of thought and fled. Whether these tales were true or exaggerated hardly mattered. The image of Edward as something other, not just brilliant but dangerous, had taken hold. One old farmer put it bluntly, "Mark me, that boy's brain will either make him a great man or a monster." Both, as history would prove, were true. Dreams of power. Edward's obsession with language sharpened into obsession with power. He believed that controlling words meant controlling thought, and controlling thought meant controlling people. He wrote furiously about the need for a universal language that could remove misunderstanding, unify mankind, and elevate the human mind. But beneath his lofty words, another motive festered: control. For if Edward could create the system, then Edward would become its master. And if he were master of the system, then he would be master of mankind. The dream of brilliance had already fused with the hunger of blood. Foreshadowing the double life. By the time Edward neared adulthood, the outlines of his double life were unmistakable. The world saw a prodigy, a scholar, a young man destined for greatness. Those closer saw a cold manipulator, a cruel experimenter, a boy whose mind was brilliant but whose heart seemed empty. Every compliment fed his pride. Every suspicion fed his bitterness. He was convinced that he was chosen, misunderstood by the small world around him, destined for something greater. But greatness, to Edward, would not come through kindness or wisdom. It would come through domination, through bending others to his will, through brilliance sharpened into a blade. And soon that blade would draw blood. By 17, Edward had become a spectacle. Word of his mind spread beyond the small villages of New York, carried by teachers who had encountered him and by the rare scholars who heard him recite. He was invited to attend higher classes, occasionally sitting in with older students at nearby academies. First, he impressed. Professors marveled at his memory, his ability to recall entire passages of obscure texts without hesitation. His essays, though sometimes grandiose, displayed an ambition far beyond his years. But admiration never lasted. Edward's arrogance poisoned every opportunity. When corrected, he smirked. When challenged, he crushed his opponent with relentless arguments until they felt humiliated. He did not seek knowledge to build, he sought it to conquer. Some professors warned him gently, "Edward, intelligence must walk with humility." He would nod politely, then later mutter, "The humble are the slaves of the weak-minded." Isolation deepens. Other students avoided him. He was not a companion, not a friend. He was a presence, cold, sharp, unsettling. While others gathered in taverns or walked with sweethearts in the evenings, Edward lingered alone with his books, filling pages with diagrams of languages that no one else could decipher. He spoke rarely of personal feelings, of dreams, of fears. Instead, every conversation turned toward his project, his universal language. To him, it was not just an academic pursuit. It was salvation. If men could speak without misunderstanding, he once told a bewildered peer, wars would end, lies would vanish, crime would be unnecessary, thought itself would be pure. The peer, confused, asked, "And who would control this language?" Edward's lips curved in a thin smile. Someone must. First deceptions. Edward soon discovered that his brilliance could be more profitable than chores or study. He began offering to write essays for other students, not for friendship, but for payment. His work dazzled teachers, earning top marks for those who paid. But he went further. He stole from libraries, rationalizing that books belonged to those who could truly use them. He forged recommendations, inflating his reputation to gain access to scholars. He lied effortlessly, with the calm precision of a man reciting memorized truths. Lies became not a tool of survival but an art. And Edward was the artist. The coldness of affection. Though young women sometimes admired his intelligence, Edward seemed incapable of true affection. He courted not with tenderness but with displays of superiority. He would quote poetry, but only to demonstrate his memory. He would offer compliments, but they dripped with condescension. One girl later recalled, "When he looked at me, it was not like a suitor, it was like a doctor examining an illness. He spoke as though he already knew everything I would say. I felt like a specimen, not a person." This inability to connect, to see others as more than subjects, widened the chasm between Edward and the world. Philosophy of power. By his late teens, Edward had formed a personal philosophy that he rarely stated plainly but lived by. The strong are meant to rule, the weak to serve. Knowledge, to him, was the ultimate form of strength. And since he possessed more than anyone around him, he believed himself destined to dominate. When a minister once challenged him, saying, "Pride comes before the fall, Edward," he responded coldly, "Then let the weak fall. I was not made to stumble." Such words, spoken with conviction, unsettled even the pious. People began to whisper not just of his genius but of his dangerous pride. The birth of the double life. It was during these years that Edward perfected what would later define him. The double life. In public, the prodigy, the scholar, the boy with a brilliant future. In private, the manipulator, the liar, the cold experimenter who treated lives like tools. He learned when to smile, when to flatter, when to play the part of the misunderstood genius. And when alone, he fed the darker hunger growing within him, the hunger not just to be admired, but to control, to dominate, to bend others to his will. This double life would later protect him, deceive entire communities, and allow him to kill without immediate suspicion. But even now, as a young man, the mask was already firmly in place. Foreshadowing the fall. By the time Edward reached his 20th year, those who had once praised him now spoke with unease. Teachers admitted his brilliance but sighed at his arrogance. Neighbors admired his memory but distrusted his cruelty. The preacher who had once warned of his gift repeated his warning more sternly. "Genius without God becomes a curse. That boy will bring grief to many before his end." The preacher's words spread quietly through the town. But Edward was deaf to warnings. In his mind, he was not cursed. He was chosen. And destiny, in his mind, was already unfolding. The shadow over Ithaca. As the 1850s drew to a close, Edward's path pointed toward the town of Ithaca, New York, a place of opportunity, of academia, of new faces who did not yet know his name. There, his double life would deepen. There, brilliance and blood would soon collide. But for now, in the waning years of his youth, Edward Rulloff stood at the threshold. A prodigy celebrated for his mind, and a shadowed figure feared for his heart. He was no longer a boy. He was a man. And the world, unsuspecting, admiring, vulnerable, lay open before him. By the late 1850s, Edward drifted toward Ithaca, New York, a town marked by academic promise, with scholars, merchants, and the shadow of the young Cornell community beginning to rise. To Edward, Ithaca was fertile ground. New people, new opportunities, and most importantly, a place where his reputation had not yet caught up to him. He presented himself as a humble teacher of languages, a scholar seeking to refine his studies. Parents, desperate to give their children an intellectual edge, welcomed him. Soon he was tutoring Latin, Greek, and even rudimentary science. His methods were unorthodox but undeniably effective. His students excelled, and whispers spread that a true genius had arrived. But behind the walls of rented rooms, his notebooks grew darker. The universal language he was creating was no longer a dream of uniting mankind. It was a design for reshaping mankind. His belief hardened. Once the system was complete, those who resisted would be swept aside. Knowledge was no longer for enlightenment. It was for conquest. The charm and the coldness Edward had perfected his mask. To those in Ithaca, he was courteous, articulate, fascinating. He could recite scripture with reverence, debate philosophy with professors, and dazzle audiences by recalling texts word for word. Women admired his seriousness. Men respected his intellect. Yet in private, the mask slipped. He was controlling with his students, belittling mistakes, demanding obedience. He mocked colleagues as mediocrities. To neighbors, he offered polite smiles, but his eyes often lingered too long, cold, calculating, as though measuring weaknesses. One townsman later recalled, "Rulloff had a way of speaking to you that made you feel like you were standing before a judge. You left his company uncertain, smaller, as though he had taken something from you without lifting a hand." The cracks in the mask, it did not take long for cracks to appear. Rumors began, whispers that books disappeared from libraries, that Edward charged families for lessons and then abandoned them, that he borrowed money and never repaid it. His brilliance shielded him, but suspicion grew. And then there were darker stories. A dog found poisoned, a student reduced to tears, claiming Rulloff had struck him in a fit of rage. An innkeeper's daughter swore he had tried to trick her into repeating phrases in a strange language, words that made no sense, words he recorded in a notebook as she stumbled over them. The town was divided. Half admired him as a prodigy. Half distrusted him as something unnatural. The philosophy of control, by now, Edward's personal philosophy, had solidified. In his journals, he wrote lines that would later haunt investigators. "The masses are clay. The enlightened are the sculptors. A system without error must be enforced, not offered. Compassion is the tool of the weak. Control is the duty of the strong." To Edward, morality was irrelevant. Truth was irrelevant. Only his vision mattered. And if achieving it required deception, theft, or blood, then so be it. Early patterns of violence, though no proven murders yet stained his name, violent tendencies had already surfaced. He fought with fellow teachers, sometimes with frightening intensity. He once threatened a colleague with a knife during an argument over teaching methods, only to later excuse himself with smooth words. There were also rumors, harder to prove, whispered more than spoken, of women who vanished after brief encounters with him. A seamstress who once lodged in the same building disappeared without trace. A servant girl who claimed Edward frightened her suddenly left town. No bodies were found, no charges filed, but the air around him thickened with suspicion. The reputation of genius and fear. Despite all this, Edward's intellect could not be ignored. His writings on language circulated quietly among academic circles. Some called him a visionary. Others dismissed him as a madman. But all agreed he was unlike anyone else. The tension between admiration and fear defined his presence. In public gatherings, people leaned in when he spoke, enthralled, unsettled. Children stared at him in awe. Parents warned them to stay clear. One observer described him as a man too large for his own skin, a mind bursting beyond the human vessel that held it, threatening to tear itself apart. The fully formed double life. By the end of the 1850s, Edward Rulloff was no longer just a prodigy with strange habits. He was a man living a double life. In daylight, the scholar, the teacher, the man of learning whose memory and intellect were unmatched. In shadow, the deceiver, the manipulator, the cold experimenter who viewed human beings as instruments. He could dine with professors in the evening and terrify a servant girl by night. He could publish fragments of scholarly brilliance while pocketing stolen goods. He could whisper promises of progress while plotting acts of cruelty. This duality, brilliance and blood, charm and cruelty, became the very core of his existence. Edward Rulloff's 20s were consumed by a single obsession: his grand theory of a universal language. To him, all of humanity's suffering, war, deception, inequality, stemmed from misunderstanding. Words, he believed, were flawed. Grammar was chaos. Vocabulary was fragmented. If he could invent a perfect system, one built on rational logic and structure, humanity itself could be reforged. But beneath this lofty ideal pulsed something darker. For Edward, the universal language was not meant to liberate mankind, it was meant to control it. In his private notes, he did not write of harmony. He wrote of power. The man who controlled the key to all thought would, in effect, control all men. One tongue, he scribbled, and one ruler. Life among scholars. Edward drifted in and out of academic circles during this period. He presented himself as a humble scholar, sometimes even feigning poverty to gain sympathy from wealthier patrons. Professors invited him into libraries, thinking him an eccentric genius. First, he dazzled. His memory was legendary. He could quote entire chapters of obscure books without hesitation. He could switch between Latin and Greek mid-sentence, leaving listeners stunned. But the longer he stayed, the more cracks appeared. Edward had no patience for equals. He could not endure correction. He belittled professors under the guise of polite debate. He argued endlessly, consumed not by truth but by the need to dominate. Slowly, invitations waned. Scholars whispered, "Brilliant, yes, but impossible. Dangerous." Masks in public, shadows in private. Edward became skilled at wearing different masks depending on his audience. To scholars, a misunderstood visionary. To neighbors, a respectable, soft-spoken teacher. To students, a demanding master, mixing kindness with cruelty. But in private, his writings revealed his true self. In journals discovered years later, he scrawled passages filled with contempt. Men are beasts who bray. Knowledge is their leash. The wise must bind them, else they trample the world in their stupidity. His double life was no longer accidental, it was deliberate. He knew how to appear harmless while quietly cultivating darker ambitions. Love and the Mask of Domesticity. In Ithaca, Edward met Harriet Shutt, a young woman of kindness and simplicity. Against expectations, they married. To outsiders, this seemed like Edward's chance at normalcy, a family life, a grounding influence. At first, the marriage appeared calm. Harriet adored her brilliant husband, though she confessed to friends she often could not follow his ideas. Edward, for his part, played the role of dutiful husband. But behind closed doors, his cruelty surfaced. He controlled Harriet's every move. He dictated what she read, when she could speak, how she managed the home. He treated her less like a partner and more like a subject in his experiment of life. Neighbors began to notice her sadness, the way she avoided their eyes, the way she shrank in his presence. But few dared speak openly, for Edward's glare could silence even the bold. The scholar turns darker during these years. Edward's scholarly pursuits mixed more openly with deception. He forged documents to gain access to exclusive libraries. He stole rare books, rationalizing that only he deserved them. He tricked wealthy patrons into lending him funds, promising groundbreaking publications that never appeared. At the same time, he began testing his theories on those around him. He demanded his students attempt bizarre linguistic exercises, twisting words into patterns that only he understood. He corrected them with rage, as though failure to grasp his system was proof of their inferiority. His obsession consumed his household. Harriet begged him to spend more time with her and their infant daughter. Edward dismissed her, locking himself away in his study. "You are flesh," he once snapped at her. "I am mind. Do not distract me with flesh." Whispers of Darkness by 1859, whispers about Edward's cruelty had grown louder. Some neighbors claimed Harriet confided fears of her husband. Others noted Edward's strange comings and goings at night, carrying books and packages into the woods. Then came stories harder to ignore. Harriet's sudden absences from public view. A baby's cry heard one night, followed by silence. Edward's increasing hostility whenever anyone asked about his family. Though no proof existed, suspicion thickened. Some said Harriet wished to leave him but feared what he might do. Others believed she was trapped, unable to escape the iron grasp of her brilliant, dangerous husband. The mask slips. It was in this period that Edward's mask of the scholar began to crack. His arrogance, his cruelty, his secrecy, all were becoming harder to hide. Yet he pressed forward, convinced that destiny protected him. His universal language was nearly complete, he believed. Soon the world would see his greatness. But as he scribbled theories late into the night, as Harriet wept quietly in their small home, as whispers of his darkness spread, a far more violent future was drawing near. Within a year, the first undeniable blood would be spilled, and Edward Rulloff would step fully from scholar to killer. By 1860, Edward's marriage to Harriet Shutt had grown unbearable. To outsiders, the household appeared quiet, perhaps even scholarly. Books stacked high, candles burning late into the night. But inside it was a prison. Harriet lived in fear of her husband. His brilliance had curdled into cruelty. He dictated her words, corrected her movements, dismissed her concerns. When she protested his endless studies, he turned cold, as though she were nothing but an insect buzzing in his ear. "You are a distraction to progress," he once hissed when she begged him to spend time with their infant daughter. The neighbors noticed. Harriet's once bright smile had dulled. She walked the streets less and less. Some whispered she was unwell. Others wondered if her husband was to blame. But no one dared interfere. Harriet's secret despair in quiet moments. Harriet confided her dread. To a close friend, she admitted, "I love him still. But there is something in him, something not human. His eyes, they do not see me. They see only themselves." She spoke of leaving, of returning to her family. But fear restrained her. Edward controlled the household, the money, even the very walls of their home. To run would be to risk his wrath. And yet Harriet's desperation grew. She began making small preparations, a letter hidden here, a conversation there. She clung to her infant daughter as though the child was her last anchor of hope. Edward's paranoia. Edward sensed her distance. His paranoia sharpened. He grew suspicious of her every word, her every glance. He accused her of plotting against him, of speaking to neighbors about his work. The more she recoiled, the more he pressed. He interrogated her at night, demanding to know where she had been, who she had spoken with, what she had said. To Edward, Harriet was not a wife. She was a subject, a variable in his grand experiment. Her resistance was betrayal, and betrayal demanded correction. The final night, one summer evening in 1861, Harriet and her infant daughter vanished. Neighbors recalled seeing Edward that day, calm as ever, carrying books beneath his arm. Later that night, some claimed they heard raised voices from the Rulloff home. Others swore they heard a cry, sharp, brief, then swallowed by silence. By morning, Harriet and the child were gone. Edward gave no explanation. To some, he muttered they had gone to visit relatives. To others, he said nothing at all. Days passed. Weeks. The women never returned. When pressed, Edward's temper flared. He forbade questions. His eyes burned with a rage that silenced even the boldest. The suspicion whispers spread quickly through Ithaca. Where was Harriet? Where was the baby? Why did Edward remain so calm? Some suspected murder. Others believed he had driven them away. A few clung to the hope they lived elsewhere. But no evidence appeared. No bodies were found. The law, lacking proof, did nothing. Edward walked the streets as before, the scholar, the teacher, the eccentric genius. But behind him followed the ghost of suspicion, heavy as shadow. The scholar after blood strangely, Edward flourished after their disappearance. Freed of domestic distractions, He threw himself into his work with renewed fervor. His writings grew darker, more elaborate. He began speaking openly of reshaping mankind. His few friends noticed a change. He was calmer, almost serene, as though a burden had been lifted. But beneath the surface lurked something colder. The absence of Harriet and the child was never spoken of. He never explained. He never mourned. He simply erased them, as though they had been nothing more than obstacles to his brilliance. The town's unease for years after, the people of Ithaca remembered the mystery. They avoided his gaze, whispered when he passed. Some swore he had buried them near his home. Others believed their bodies were sunk in the lake. But Edward remained untouchable. His mind was his shield. Without proof, the law could not touch him. Without courage, neighbors dared not confront him. He continued lecturing, tutoring, writing. The mask of the scholar remained, but now it was smeared with the invisible blood of those who had lived under his roof. The transformation, the disappearance of Harriet and the infant marked the true turning point. Edward was no longer simply a man of dangerous ideas. He had crossed into blood. The crime was never proven, but it reshaped him. He had tested the boundaries of life and death, of control and consequence, and he had survived. From that moment, Edward Rulloff lived as though he were invincible. His mind was his weapon. His crimes were shadows, and the world was clay for him to mold. The scholar's mask had served him well, but now, beneath it, the killer stirred more openly. And soon, the shadows would deepen. By the mid-1860s, Edward had become entangled with criminals. At first, it seemed absurd. How could a man of letters and learning consort with burglars and pickpockets? Yet, the underworld saw in him something useful. He became a mentor of sorts, teaching thieves strategy, planning, and cunning. Where they had brawn, he had mind. He mapped escape routes, studied police patterns, even taught accomplices how to use disguises and false papers. To Edward, crime was simply another form of study, a laboratory for testing the application of intelligence to survival. To the thieves, he was a dangerous but invaluable partner. The man who could think 10 steps ahead. A house of shadows. Whenever Edward settled for long, his home became a strange laboratory. He collected books obsessively, linguistic tomes, medical manuals, volumes of philosophy. Alongside them, neighbors noticed stranger items. Jars, odd instruments, and scraps of writing filled with symbols no one understood. He claimed to be working on his great system of thought, his universal language. But rumors whispered of experiments that blurred the line between scholarship and madness. Some claimed he dissected animals in his cellar, muttering about anatomy and language. Others said he practiced mesmerism or early forms of hypnosis on unwitting visitors. Whether true or not, the rumors clung to him like smoke. False faces, false lives. Edward became a master of disguise. He could appear as a poor schoolteacher one month, a confident doctor the next. He forged documents, shifted towns, and left behind confused trails. Authorities pursued him on charges of theft, fraud, and suspicion of darker deeds. But each time he slipped away, reinventing himself. His brilliance, once aimed at academic glory, was now wholly bent to deception. Every false identity was a test, every escape a proof of his intellectual superiority. "Law is a net for the dull," he once wrote. "The sharp mind passes through." The ghost of Harriet yet, though he vanished from Ithaca, he could not fully escape Harriet's ghost. Wherever he went, whispers followed. Some townspeople remembered the scholar whose wife and child had never returned. Others, recognizing his face, whispered murderer under their breath. But without evidence, he remained untouchable. And in Edward's mind, the absence of proof was not luck. It was destiny. He believed he was chosen, protected by the very brilliance of his mind. Criminal mastermind. By 1867, Edward was no longer just a scholar dabbling in crime. He was orchestrating it. He joined forces with younger, less educated criminals who looked up to him as both mentor and commander. He devised burglary schemes, identified wealthy targets, and taught accomplices how to read maps and blueprints. But his arrogance grew. He demanded loyalty, obedience, reverence. When an accomplice questioned his orders, Edward turned cold. "You would not tell Newton how to solve his problem of gravity," he said. "Why, then, would you tell me how to solve crime?" To his followers, he was half genius, half tyrant. To himself, he was evolving, no longer a mere man, but a thinker above morality. The law tightened still, his actions did not go unnoticed. The police, though often baffled, began connecting trails of theft and forgery back to the wandering scholar with too many names. He was arrested more than once, but each time he outwitted his captors. In court, he defended himself with eloquence. He dazzled judges with quotations, confused juries with rhetoric, twisted evidence into doubt. Even when convicted, he managed escapes, slipping through the cracks of the system. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a misunderstood genius. To himself, he was invincible. The calm before greater violence. By the late 1860s, Edward Rulloff had perfected his double life. To scholars, he was eccentric but brilliant. To criminals, he was a mastermind. To neighbors, he was unsettling but polite. But beneath it all, the same darkness that had consumed Harriet still burned. And as the years stretched on, his crimes escalated. Theft was no longer enough. Deception no longer satisfied. Soon, blood would return. By 1869, Edward Rulloff's double life was reaching its breaking point. For years, he had slipped between scholar and criminal, teacher and thief, thinker and killer. But the walls were closing in. The police, once baffled by his disguises and false identities, were beginning to trace his movements. Edward, however, remained defiant. Each arrest was, in his eyes, a debate rather than a defeat. He treated police interrogations like intellectual duels. He corrected their grammar mid-question, mocked their ignorance of philosophy, and often managed to twist their certainty into hesitation. But something had changed. Edward was no longer content with simply outwitting the law. He wanted to defy it openly. His arrogance demanded an audience. The burglary that broke the silence in 1869, Edward aligned himself with two younger accomplices, Albert Jarvis and William Dexter, petty criminals who idolized his intelligence. Together, they planned a high-stakes burglary, the looting of a dry goods store in Binghamton, New York. Edward's role was not the brute labor. He was the architect. He sketched the layout, timed the guards, mapped the escape. To his accomplices, it was brilliant. To Edward, it was art. But the burglary went wrong. In the chaos of the theft, a clerk named Frederick Merrick resisted. Edward, unwilling to leave witnesses, turned violent. Merrick was struck down, his skull shattered. It was the first public blood Edward spilled, no longer hidden behind whispers of Harriet's disappearance. This time, the violence left a corpse for the world to see. The capture, the aftermath, was chaos. Jarvis and Dexter fled into the night, pursued by police. Edward too attempted escape, but this time the net closed around him. He was seized, not as the eccentric scholar, but as a murderer. The arrest shocked those who had once admired him. Professors who had marveled at his memory now read headlines branding him a killer. Neighbors who had whispered about Harriet now spoke aloud of blood confirmed. Edward himself, however, was calm. When brought before the court, he stood tall, adjusted his coat, and spoke with the same confidence as always. "You mistake me for a criminal," he said coldly. "I am a man of science. This is the persecution of intellect by ignorance." The trial of the genius killer. Edward's trial became a sensation. Newspapers devoured the story. The brilliant linguist who had lived a double life of crime, the man suspected of killing his wife years before, the mastermind who could recite Latin poetry and shatter a man's skull with equal ease. Witnesses described his arrogance in the courtroom. He corrected lawyers, debated judges, and even lectured the jury on the philosophy of punishment. To him, the trial was not about his guilt but about his superiority. At night, however, in the solitude of his cell, he scribbled furiously. Pages upon pages of linguistic theories, outlines of his universal language, and rants against society poured from his pen. He seemed less concerned with his looming execution than with the unfinished system that consumed his life. A mind on display. Doctors examined him, fascinated by the contrast between his intellect and his crimes. Was Edward a madman? A genius? A sociopath? Opinions split. Some declared him insane, his brilliance poisoned by obsession. Others insisted he was fully rational, a man who chose evil deliberately. Edward himself rejected the notion of madness. "If crime is the child of genius, then so be it," he told one physician. "Better to live as a giant among insects than to crawl as they do." The shadow of Harriet returns during the trial. Whispers of Harriet's disappearance resurfaced. Prosecutors hinted at his wife and child, gone without trace. Though they could not prove murder, the suggestion darkened the jury's view. The memory of the vanished woman and child now merged with the blood on his hands. For Edward, it was an old ghost rising at the worst possible time. What he had erased years before now haunted him in open court. Conviction in September 1870, Edward Rulloff was found guilty of murder. The verdict rang through the courtroom, and for once, the scholar's mask faltered. He raged against the decision, calling the jury fools, the court corrupt, the system blind to genius. Yet the sentence was clear: death by hanging. The writing frenzy facing execution, Edward became frantic. He begged for more time, not for his life but for his work. He pleaded with scholars, journalists, and even the governor. Allow him to finish his universal language. Letters poured out of his cell. He described his theories with desperation, insisting they would transform human thought forever. He promised mankind a new dawn if only he were spared. But the world was unmoved. His crimes outweighed his words. The execution date was set. After his conviction in 1870, Edward Rulloff was transferred to the Broome County Jail in Binghamton, New York, to await execution. He was no longer the untouchable fugitive or the respected eccentric. He was now a condemned man. But Edward refused to see himself that way. He wore his prison sentence like a temporary inconvenience, speaking as though the law had made a grave error. To guards and visitors, he declared his innocence of Merrick's murder, while simultaneously boasting of his superior intellect. "You may take my life," he said coldly, "but you cannot take my mind. My discoveries will live long after these ignorant men have crumbled to dust." The plea for time in the months before his execution, Edward embarked on a desperate campaign, not to save his life, but to save his work. He wrote letter after letter to professors, journalists, and politicians. He begged the governor for a stay of execution, arguing that his universal language project was of greater value than his death. Newspapers reported his pleas with fascination. Some mocked him as a delusional murderer clinging to vanity. Others hesitated, wondering if perhaps this condemned man truly held a discovery worth preserving. But time was running short. The final writings in his cell, Edward filled page after page with his theories. He scribbled linguistic symbols, mathematical structures, and philosophical rants. His handwriting grew frantic, desperate, as though he believed he could outrun the gallows with ink and paper. Scholars who visited him left with mixed impressions. Some found his ideas fascinating, even brilliant. Others dismissed them as the ramblings of a man unmoored from reality. But one thing was clear. Edward believed with all his being that he was destined to be remembered not as a murderer, but as a genius cut down too soon. The public spectacle by early 1871, the execution was scheduled. Crowds gathered in Binghamton to catch a glimpse of the infamous genius killer. The newspapers dubbed him the last man to be hanged in the state of New York. The phrase clung to his name like an epitaph. For some, he was a curiosity. For others, a monster finally meeting justice. Edward relished the attention. He spoke to reporters with eloquence, often turning interviews into philosophical monologues. He wanted his final days recorded, not as tragedy, but as legend. The final meal and the final words on the eve of his execution, Edward ate calmly. Unlike many condemned men, he showed no outward fear. He even joked with guards, quoting lines of poetry and philosophy. But beneath his composure, he seethed. He railed at the waste of his intellect, insisting mankind would regret his death. To one visitor, he declared, The state kills a man of science and preserves thieves. That is the measure of your civilization. On the morning of May 18, 1871, Edward was led to the gallows. The crowd pressed close, eager to see the notorious criminal fall. He walked steadily, head high, as though he were not being led to death but to a lecture hall. When asked for his final words, he smirked, "Hurry it up. I want to be in hell in time for dinner." The trapdoor opened. The rope snapped tight. Edward's body jerked, then fell still. The man who had lived as both scholar and killer, who had murdered in shadows and written of brilliance, was finally silenced. The crowd dispersed, carrying with them a mix of awe, disgust, and grim satisfaction. Edward's death did not end his legend. Scholars debated his work for decades. Some studied his linguistic theories, noting glimpses of innovation buried beneath his arrogance. Others dismissed him entirely, branding him a fraud who cloaked madness in the language of science. But his story remained unforgettable. A man who embodied the terrifying union of intellect and violence, of brilliance and blood. He was remembered not only as a murderer, but as a chilling reminder that genius, unchecked by conscience, can become a weapon more dangerous than ignorance. In history books, Edward Rulloff became the last man publicly hanged in New York State. But in darker histories, he became something else. The genius killer, a man whose mind and crimes remain entangled in a legacy of brilliance and brutality. His life ended on a rope, but his ghost, of intellect corrupted, of knowledge turned to horror, continues to haunt the shadowed corners of history. When Edward Rulloff's body fell still on the gallows in May 1871, the crowd dispersed, but the story did not end there. His death sparked questions that would ripple through the late 19th and even into the 20th century. Who exactly had they executed? Was he a monster who deserved nothing but the rope? Or was he, as some insisted, a genius silenced before his discoveries could flourish? The contradiction of his life, scholar and killer, thinker and thief, refused to fade. Instead, it deepened. The body of a genius after Edward's execution. Scientists and physicians were eager to examine him. His brain, they believed, might hold the key to the mystery of his dual nature. It was preserved and measured, recorded at 59 ounces, one of the largest brains ever documented. For decades, medical students and researchers studied it, searching for signs that could explain his brilliance and his violence. Was his genius simply a byproduct of abnormal anatomy? Or was it proof that intellect alone cannot restrain darkness? The scholar in chains even in death, Edward's writings continued to circulate. Fragments of his linguistic theories survived, though incomplete. A handful of scholars examined them, some impressed by flashes of originality, others dismissing them as incoherent obsession. A few sympathetic writers argued that New York had executed not just a murderer, but a man who might have transformed language and philosophy. Others countered that his obsession was nothing more than delusion wrapped in the costume of scholarship. The debate itself became part of his legacy. The criminal as a case study. By the late 19th century, criminology was emerging as a science. Edward Rulloff became one of its most infamous case studies. Doctors, philosophers, and legal scholars examined his life, not just as a story of crime but as an experiment in human duality. Some labeled him a psychopath before the word was even common. Others saw him as proof of the born criminal theory that biology predetermined evil. But still others were unsettled. They saw in Rulloff not simply a killer, but a man whose intelligence made his crimes more terrifying, not less. The cultural echoes writers and journalists could not resist the drama of his life. Stories, novels, and essays reimagined him as a tragic genius, a cold-blooded villain, or a cautionary tale about pride. His final words, "Hurry it up. I want to be in hell in time for dinner," were repeated endlessly, a chilling mixture of wit and cruelty. They became part of his legend, cementing him as one of the most memorable executions in American history. The ghost in scholarship in universities, his name was occasionally raised as a caution, the scholar who wasted his brilliance. Professors told the story to warn students about arrogance, obsession, and the dangers of intellect without morality. For criminologists, he was a specimen. For philosophers, a paradox. For the public, a dark curiosity. He existed in the uneasy space between genius and evil, a reminder that intellect alone does not save the soul. The split legacy. By the early 20th century, Edward Rulloff's memory had hardened into two competing images. The genius cut short, a man of rare intellect, whose discovery of a universal language might have changed the world, if only society had spared him. The genius killer, a murderer who cloaked brutality in the illusion of scholarship, a warning of what brilliance without conscience can become. Both images persisted. Neither erased the other. His name remained suspended between admiration and horror. Brilliance entwined with blood. In the end, Edward Rulloff's legacy was not his unfinished books or his preserved brain, but the haunting question he left behind. Can brilliance and evil exist in the same man without one consuming the other? For Rulloff, the answer was written in blood. His intellect gave him power, but his arrogance and violence destroyed him. He remains, even now, a figure half in shadow, too brilliant to dismiss, too monstrous to forgive. Edward Rulloff's body swung from the gallows in 1871. His story has lived on. Historians, criminologists, psychologists, and true crime writers continue to dissect his life. Not just for the crimes he committed, but for the unsettling paradox he embodied. He was not the most prolific killer of his age. He was not the most brilliant scholar. Yet the fusion of both identities, murderer and intellectual, brute and genius, has ensured his place in history. The mind preserved for more than a century, his preserved brain was displayed at Cornell University's Wilder Brain Collection. Visitors and students peered at the Jared organ, fascinated by its size and history. To some, it was proof of his extraordinary intellect, a physical relic of genius. To others, it was a morbid trophy, the remains of a killer elevated by curiosity. Even now, scientists revisit the specimen, measuring, scanning, comparing. It remains one of the largest human brains ever recorded. But no matter the data, it cannot explain the contradictions that lived inside Edward. The scholar's ghost. Modern linguists occasionally revisit fragments of Rulloff's writings. His theories on a universal language remain incomplete, but some see hints of innovation. A few note that he anticipated ideas later explored in structural linguistics. Yet the majority agree. His obsession with language was less about discovery and more about control. Just as he controlled people through lies, manipulation, and violence, he sought to control meaning itself. His scholarship was not an act of service to humanity, but an extension of his will to dominate. The psychology of Rulloff. Psychologists today describe Edward Rulloff as a textbook case of malignant narcissism or psychopathy. He displayed grandiosity, an unshakable belief in his genius and superiority. Manipulation, using charm and intellect to deceive accomplices, scholars, and even courts. Lack of empathy. His victims were pawns, obstacles, or tools, never people. Dual life, public scholar, private killer. In modern terms, Rulloff was not an enigma but a chillingly clear case of intelligence weaponized by pathology. The cultural fascination, true crime literature, and documentaries continue to feature Rulloff. He represents a trope that grips audiences. The killer who is brilliant, the man who could lecture on Latin by day and kill without hesitation by night. His life blurs boundaries. Was he a man destroyed by his intellect, or a killer who used intellect as a mask? That ambiguity keeps his story alive. The warning in his story, what makes Edward's story endure, is not simply his crimes, but the lesson within them. He proves that genius does not equal goodness. Intelligence without morality can become more dangerous than ignorance. A brilliant man with no conscience is not a gift to humanity, but a threat to it. This is why his name lingers in criminology textbooks, in whispered legends, in exhibits of preserved brains. He is not remembered for the language he dreamed of creating, but for the blood he spilled while dreaming it. Reflections. Brilliance and blood. When we look back at Edward Rulloff, we see a man who could have been remembered as a scholar. Instead, he is remembered as a killer. His story leaves us with haunting questions. What if his brilliance had been guided by conscience? What if his discoveries had been completed before his crimes consumed him? And most chillingly, how many other Rulloffs might walk among us, brilliant minds cloaked in darkness? The answers remain speculative, but his life stands as both fascination and warning. Itu.